The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Crisp ivory cardstock with gold embossing that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison and Thomas Michael Henley request the pleasure of your company. I stared at the familiar handwriting in the address. Mom's careful script, the same one that used to write my name on birthday cards before everything went to hell. Sarah Morrison. She'd kept Dad's name even after what happened, even after she helped destroy him. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter next to a stack of overdue bills and medical debt notices, the contrast almost laughable. Here was my little sister, though she wasn't little anymore, was she? Inviting me to watch her marry into the very family that had orchestrated our father's downfall. The family that had stolen everything from us. From me. 11 years. 11 years since I'd fled this God-forsaken town with nothing but a backpack and a heart full of rage. 11 years since the Henley family had systematically destroyed my father's construction business, his reputation, and ultimately his will to live. And now, my sister was marrying Thomas Henley, son of the man who had killed our father as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. I should have thrown the invitation away. Should have continued living my quiet life 3 states away, working my way up from construction worker to project manager, slowly rebuilding what they'd taken from us. But as I stared at that elegant script, all I could think about was Dad's face the night before he died, hollow, defeated, whispering apologies for things that weren't his fault. 3 weeks later, I was standing in the back of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching my sister float down the aisle in a dress that cost more than Dad's truck. She looked radiant, glowing with happiness that made my chest tight, with something between love and betrayal. How could she look so happy marrying the enemy? I'd changed a lot in 11 years. The scrawny 17-year-old who'd left town in shame was now a 30-year-old man with calloused hands, broad shoulders, and a face weathered by honest work. I'd grown a beard, let my hair get longer, and the expensive suit I'd bought for this occasion transformed me into someone unrecognizable. When I'd signed the guest book, I'd used my middle name, James Mitchell, instead of James Morrison, just another wedding guest from out of town. Beautiful ceremony, the elderly woman next to me whispered, as Sarah and Thomas exchanged vows. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Beautiful, yes, and built on a foundation of lies and blood money. The reception was held at the Henley estate. Of course it was. The same sprawling property that Dad had helped build back when he thought Richard Henley was his friend and business partner, before he learned that Henley had been systematically underbidding his contracts, stealing his clients, and spreading rumors about shoddy workmanship. Before the bank called, in the loans that Henley had somehow influenced them to accelerate. Before Dad lost everything and couldn't see any way out except the bottle of pills he'd found in Mom's medicine cabinet. I walked through the gardens where Dad and I had once installed an elaborate fountain system, remembering how proud he'd been of the intricate stonework. "Built to last generations, Jimmy," he'd said, ruffling my hair. The fountain was still there, still beautiful, but now it felt like a monument to everything they'd stolen from us. The reception was in full swing when I finally made my move. I'd spent hours watching, listening, learning. Richard Henley was holding court near the bar, regaling guests with stories about his business success. Sarah was glowing as she made rounds with her new husband, accepting congratulations and well wishes. Mom sat at the family table, looking older than her 62 years, but smiling genuinely for the first time I could remember. I approached the microphone during the lull between toasts, my heart hammering against my ribs. The crowd quieted as I tapped the mic, hundreds of faces turning toward me with polite curiosity. "Good evening, everyone. I hope you'll indulge me for a moment." My voice was steady, years of construction site management having taught me how to project authority. I'd like to share a story about the Morrison family and their connection to this beautiful celebration. Sarah's head snapped up from across the room, her face suddenly pale. She was studying me intently, something flickering behind her eyes. Recognition? Fear? I couldn't tell from this distance. You see, 17 years ago, a man named David Morrison began working with Richard Henley on various construction projects around town. David was a good man, honest, hardworking, devoted to his family. He trusted Richard as a business partner and friend. The crowd was listening politely, but I could see confusion on many faces. Richard Henley had straightened near the bar, his jovial expression fading into something more guarded. David Morrison had big dreams. He wanted to expand his small construction company, maybe leave something behind for his 2 children. So when Richard suggested they formalize their partnership, David jumped at the chance. He signed contracts, took out loans, put everything on the line. My voice was getting stronger now, carrying across the tent. I could see wedding guests exchanging glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. But Richard Henley had different plans. While David was working 16-hour days trying to fulfill their joint contracts, Richard was systematically undermining him, stealing clients, spreading lies about David's work quality, using his connections to manipulate bank loans and city permits. "Excuse me," Richard Henley's voice boomed from across the tent. He was moving toward me, his face red with indignation. "I don't know who you are, sir, but this is neither the time nor place for—" "My name is James Morrison," I said into the microphone, my words cutting through his protest like a blade. David Morrison was my father. The tent went dead silent. Sarah's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. Thomas looked confused, glancing between his new wife and me. But Mom stood up slowly from her chair, her hand pressed to her chest, tears already streaming down her face. "Jimmy," she whispered, though the microphone picked it up and broadcast it to everyone. "Hi, Mom," I said, my carefully constructed composure cracking slightly. Then I turned back to the crowd, to Richard Henley, who had frozen halfway across the tent. Richard Henley destroyed my father's business and reputation through systematic fraud and manipulation. When Dad realized what was happening, when the contracts dried up and the loans came due, and his good name was ruined throughout the construction community, he tried to fight back. But Richard had connections, money, influence. Dad had nothing but the truth, and apparently that wasn't enough. Security guards, Henley's men, I realized, were moving toward me now, but guests were blocking their path, too absorbed in the drama to step aside. My father died 11 years ago. Suicide, they said. But I know better. David Morrison was murdered by Richard Henley's greed and malice, as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. The tent erupted in shocked murmurs. Some guests were standing now, others pulling out phones to record. Sarah was sobbing, Thomas holding her while looking completely bewildered. But it was Richard Henley's face that held my attention. Pale now, his earlier bluster replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. David Morrison was unstable. Everyone knew that. His business failed because he was incompetent, not because of any— "I have the documents, Mr. Henley." I pulled out a manila envelope from my jacket. 11 years gives a person time to investigate, to dig up records, to find people willing to talk. I have copies of the contracts you altered after Dad signed them. Bank records showing how you influenced the loan officers. Emails between you and city officials discussing how to delay Morrison construction permits while fast-tracking your own projects. The security guards had finally reached me, but I held up my hand. "I'm not done yet." I have testimony from 3 of your former employees who witnessed you bribing building inspectors to find fault with Dad's work. I have financial records showing how you systematically undercut his bids by accessing information you shouldn't have had. And I have a recording of you, drunk at a bar 2 years ago, bragging to someone about how you ran that Morrison bastard out of business. Richard Henley looked like he was going to be sick. Several guests were staring at him with obvious disgust, and I could hear people whispering, the sound growing louder, like an approaching storm. But here's what I find most interesting, I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos. 11 years ago, when Dad lost everything, and I had to drop out of college and leave town because we couldn't afford rent, Sarah chose to stay. My own sister, who I thought would stick by family no matter what, chose to believe Richard Henley's lies about Dad, chose to accept the money he offered for college expenses, chose to intern at his company, chose to date his son. Sarah was openly weeping now, and for the first time since I'd started talking, I felt a stab of doubt. She looked devastated, broken in a way that reminded me of Dad in those final weeks. "Sarah," I said, speaking directly to her now, "I know you were young. I know you were scared, but how could you? How could you marry into the family that destroyed ours?" "I didn't know," she cried out, her voice raw with anguish. "Jimmy, I swear to God, I didn't know. When you left, when Dad died, Richard told me. He said Dad was sick, that he'd made bad business decisions, that the family wanted to help us because they felt sorry for what happened. I was 18 and terrified, and Mom was falling apart, and he seemed like the only person offering any stability." She was moving toward me now, pushing through the crowd of stunned guests. "I thought you abandoned us. You just disappeared. No word for 11 years. No calls, no letters, nothing. I thought you blamed me for not being able to save Dad, for not being enough reason for him to stay alive." The microphone picked up her words, broadcasting our family's pain to 300 wedding guests, but I didn't care anymore. She reached me and grabbed my arms, her wedding dress pooling around her feet. "I loved Dad too," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "I've dreamed about him every night for 11 years, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. And I've dreamed about you too, wondering where you went, if you were okay, if you'd ever forgive me for not being stronger." I stared down at her, this woman who used to be my baby sister, and saw Dad's eyes looking back at me. The same eyes that had been haunted in those final weeks, the same eyes that had asked me to take care of Sarah before everything fell apart. "I tried to find you," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "For years, I hired investigators, posted on websites, contacted your old friends. It was like you'd vanished from the earth. And when Thomas proposed, I kept thinking about how Dad always said he wanted to walk me down the aisle someday, and how you should be the one to do it now, but I didn't know where you were or if you'd even want to. The fight went out of me all at once. This wasn't the revenge I'd planned. I'd wanted to humiliate the Henleys, to expose their crimes in front of their friends and family, to destroy their reputation the way they destroyed Dad's. I'd wanted Sarah to realize what she'd done, to feel the weight of her betrayal. But looking at her now, I realized she'd been carrying that weight all along. "Mr. Morrison Thomas Henley stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I had no idea about any of this. My father never told me about his history with your family, and Sarah never mentioned. She said her father died when she was young, but not the circumstances." He turned to his father, who was now surrounded by angry guests demanding answers. "Is it true? What he's saying about Mr. Morrison's business?" Richard Henley looked old suddenly, deflated. The king of his little empire watching his kingdom crumble around him. "It's complicated, Thomas." "Business is complicated. Sometimes you have to make hard choices. Is it true? Thomas's voice was steel now. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Finally, Richard nodded almost imperceptibly. Some of it, yes. The tent erupted again, but I barely heard it. I was focused on Thomas, watching him process this information. His wedding day, the happiest day of his life, and he was learning that his father was a criminal and his new wife was the daughter of a man his family had driven to suicide. "Sarah," he said quietly, turning back to us. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know," she cried. "Richard told me Dad's business failed because of bad decisions and market conditions. He said Dad was drinking heavily, making mistakes, that it was sad but not anyone's fault. I believed him because I was a kid, and I needed someone to blame besides myself." Thomas looked between Sarah and me, then at his father, who was now being confronted by several prominent business leaders who'd apparently had their own dealings with him over the years. "What do you want?" he asked me simply. "You've exposed the truth. You've ruined the wedding, probably destroyed my father's reputation and business. What more do you want?" It was a fair question, and I realized I didn't have a good answer anymore. For 11 years, I dreamed of this moment, the moment when I'd make them all pay. But now, standing here with my sister sobbing in my arms and watching 300 people's lives implode because of secrets and lies, I felt hollow. "I wanted justice for Dad," I said finally. "I wanted the truth to come out. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. I wanted my sister back. "I'm here," she whispered. "I've always been here. I just didn't know where you were." Over the next hour, the reception collapsed into chaos. Richard Henley was confronted by guest after guest, former business partners and clients who suddenly understood their own experiences with him in a new light. Several people mentioned contacting lawyers and investigators. The man who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable was now facing the very real possibility of criminal charges and civil lawsuits. Thomas shocked everyone by publicly apologizing to Sarah and me, declaring that he'd had no knowledge of his father's crimes and that he would do everything in his power to make amends. He offered to help with any legal proceedings and to personally compensate our family for what his father had done. Sarah refused to leave my side, clinging to me like I might disappear again if she let go. We sat together at an empty table while the tent slowly cleared out, wedding guests departing in stunned clusters, already spreading the story throughout the town. "I kept Dad's toolbox," she said quietly, "and his hard hat. And that photo of him teaching you to use the level when you were 12? I have boxes of his things in storage because I couldn't bear to go through them, but I couldn't bear to throw them away either." I squeezed her hand, remembering that photo. Dad's big hands guiding mine, showing me how to read the bubble, how to make sure everything was straight and true. "Built to last," he'd always say about his work. I'd thought that philosophy had died with him, but maybe it had just been dormant. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. I looked around the ruins of her wedding reception, overturned chairs, abandoned champagne glasses, discarded programs scattered across the floor. Then I looked at my sister, still in her wedding dress but with her makeup streaked and her carefully styled hair falling loose around her shoulders. She looked young again, like the scared 18-year-old I'd left behind. "Now we figure it out together," I said. "I'm not disappearing again. I can't promise it'll be easy. There's a lot of hurt to work through, a lot of years to bridge, but I'm not leaving you alone anymore." Thomas appeared beside our table, having changed out of his tuxedo and into jeans and a t-shirt. He looked exhausted and older than his 32 years. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For my father, for what happened to yours, for today turning into this." Sarah looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. "What does this mean for us?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from us. I don't know. I need time to process all of this. My father is probably going to be arrested, my family's reputation is destroyed, and I just learned that my wife's family was destroyed by mine. It's not exactly what I imagined when I woke up this morning. But you still love her, I said. It wasn't a question. Thomas looked at Sarah with an expression that reminded me of how Dad used to look at Mom, like she was the center of his universe, even when that universe was falling apart. Yes, I still love her. She's not responsible for what my father did, any more than I am. And she's not responsible for what our father did either, I added. Dad made his own choice at the end. We can't carry that guilt forever. Over the following months, the town of Millfield was rocked by the biggest scandal in its history. Richard Henley was arrested on multiple charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. His construction empire crumbled as investigations revealed decades of corrupt practices. Former competitors came forward with their own stories of how he'd destroyed their businesses, and it became clear that my father was just one of many victims. Sarah and Thomas postponed their honeymoon indefinitely while dealing with the legal fallout, but they stayed together. Their marriage had been tested in the most extreme way possible on its very first day, and somehow it had survived. Maybe that was a good sign for their future. I moved back to Millfield using my 11 years of experience and the settlement money from Henley's bankruptcy to start my own construction company. I named it Morrison & Morrison Construction, a partnership between me and Dad's memory, built on the foundation of everything he'd taught me about integrity and craftsmanship. Sarah joined the company as office manager, using the business degree she'd earned, ironically, with scholarship money from Richard Henley, to help us build something honest and lasting. We worked well together, falling back into the easy partnership we'd had as kids, though now it was tempered by the wisdom that comes from loss and separation. Mom moved in with me for a while, the three of us slowly healing the wounds that 11 years apart had created. We talked about Dad constantly, sharing memories, grieving together, celebrating the good times we'd forgotten in the shadow of his death. We visited his grave every Sunday, bringing him updates on the business and the family he'd left behind. One evening, about 6 months after the wedding, I was working late in my office when Sarah knocked on the door. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing one of Dad's old flannel shirts over her jeans. "Remember what Dad used to say about building things?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Built to last," I replied automatically. "I've been thinking about that." "About what it really means." She handed me one of the coffee cups, steam rising between us in the lamplight. "I don't think he just meant buildings and structures. I think he meant families, too, relationships, the things that really matter." I leaned back in my chair, studying my sister's face. She looked more like Mom every day, but she had Dad's determination in her eyes. "We fell apart after he died," she continued. "The family he built, the connection between us. But we're building it back now, aren't we? Stronger than before because we understand how precious it is." Outside, I could hear the night sounds of our little town, the same sounds Dad would have heard walking home from job sites all those years ago. But they sounded different now, less like an ending and more like a beginning. "Yeah," I said, raising my coffee cup in a toast to everything we'd lost and everything we'd found again. Built to last. And this time, I believed it would be.